All right, good morning. My name is Elizabeth Robbins, Vice President for Communications here at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. FDD is a nonpartisan research institute focused on national security and foreign policy. As a point of principle, we do not accept foreign funding. Thanks to Senior VP for Research, Jonathan Schanzer, for briefing us today. He's back from top-level meetings in Israel with Israeli political and military officials as they close in on 100 days at war next week. Dr. Schanzer will help us understand the situation there and what to expect next. Today's conversation is on the record. John will provide insights and take your questions. You're welcome to submit your questions via chat at any time or raise your hand to be recognized after initial comments. Over to you, John.
Thanks, Beth, and thanks to all of you guys for joining. I got back on Friday from a whirlwind trip, just a couple of days on the ground. It was my first trip actually since the war had started. I'll share a few thoughts kind of thematically about what I heard. I definitely had some excellent access, talked to some top folks. I'm not able to tell you who I spoke to. It was all Chatham House, but what I can tell you is that these were top political and military people that gave me a good sense of what the Israelis are thinking about right now during the current conflict. I'll start by saying this, that there was a word that came up a lot that I don't think is fully understood here when we talk about the media narrative, so to speak. The Israelis that I talked to, all of them expressed shame. It was a really interesting word to hear uttered more than one time. There was shame in having failed on the intelligence side of things, shame in terms of the way that the IDF failed to perform on the day of the attack. And there, I think, is an effort right now to kind of rebuild in real time the intelligence system, and there's obviously a fierce sense of pride about the way that the military has been operating, looking at the way that the reservists have been deployed and the way that they've been performing on the battlefield. One gets a sense that the Israelis are kind of rebuilding their brand internally for the internal consumption of the Israeli public, who lost a lot of faith on the day of the attack. And then there's also the question of deterrence and how Israel's being viewed by its enemies and adversaries around the region. A fascinating conversation that I had really dealt with the 4 different timelines that the Israelis are wrestling with right now. I'll go through those briefly, but I think it's an interesting way of looking thematically at what's going on right now and the pressures that Israel feels like it's under. The first timeline is military. Obviously, the Israelis need time in order to notch the military achievements that they've set out for themselves. This includes the killing or capture of some of the top leaders like Yahya Sinwar and Mohammed Deif. But it also is about, conquering Hamas-controlled territory. Khan Yunis seems to be the big one right now. But they are obviously clearly aware of the restraints that are being increasingly put upon them by the United States. But I will say, by the way, that even as they're feeling that tension, they're feeling that pressure, I heard nothing but thank yous for the U.S. support. I think Joe Biden is probably one of the most popular presidents in Israeli history, based on what I've heard from officials there. They were over the moon at the kind of support that they had been getting. They were aware that that clock is ticking now, though, and so they're wrestling with that timeline. So military timeline is one. Then comes the policy timeline, and we've heard a lot about the day after, the conversations about sort of, Israel needing to come up with a plan that would make Gaza viable. They do feel that there is pressure to come up with that plan, and actually, from folks that I talked to, there have been multiple efforts underway. I don't know how the Israelis are going to square this, because the IDF seems to have one, the political echelons seem to have one. And by the way, left and right have different day after scenarios, but they do get a sense that they need to come up with something soon that is going to be accepted by the United States, by the international community, by the Gulf Arab states that have normalized with Israel. Obviously, Egypt and Jordan are part of this scenario as well. And by the way, that day after scenario also does include the questions about the Palestinian Authority and its viability after this. And I understand that today there were some tough conversations that took place between Abu Mazen and Secretary of State Blinken on exactly what that role might look like. So those are the two. Now, the third timeline is the Israeli political horizon. There is a clear sense among many, not everyone, but many, that this current government has an egg timer that's going to go off at some point. Um, whether that's 6 weeks or 6 months, no one knows exactly, but there is a sense that time is going to have to wind down. I did hear that Itamar Ben-Gvir, the right-wing politician in Israel, could be the one that ultimately brings down the government. That is the current thinking among the political types that I talk to, although that is just, I think, that's a best case or a best guess, if you will, from some of the political analysts that I chatted with. But that political horizon, you get a sense it's a question of months, certainly not years, maybe even weeks, depending on how things go in Israel, how the battle goes. The last timeline is the American political timeline. We've entered into political season here, and the Israelis are deeply concerned that their war is becoming a political football in our election season. They don't want their war to be part of the discussion here, because obviously their goals are very different than what our politicians are thinking about. So when you add up all four of these timelines, the military, the political, or rather the military, the policy, the Israeli political, and the American political, you get a sense that and all these timelines are not necessarily aligned, and they may have a significant impact on the way the war plays out. Another key theme that I picked up on was the tension between the hostages, the decision to really the rhetoric that's come out of the IDF and from the government itself, the political types, that they are going to do everything that they possibly can to save the hostages. But then there's the question of victory, right? And we've all heard the stories. I'd been hearing this for the last 2 or 3 weeks now, that Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, had surrounded himself with a number of the Israeli hostages that were taken on 10/7. He's doing this as a means to give himself an insurance policy. He believes that as long as he's surrounded by the hostages, that he probably will not be killed or captured. And so when the Israelis say that they're going to save all of the hostages and that they're going to kill or capture Yahya Sinwar, you can immediately see the friction here within the Israeli policies. And how they decide to prioritize one over the other is yet to be seen. But there is, I think, a sense that the numbers of hostages that are still living, while they don't have definitive proof, they do have still eyes and ears throughout the Gaza Strip, and they're concerned that those numbers are going to dwindle. But as they dwindle, that may begin to influence the calculus about what is done with regard to Sinwar or Day for others that they believe are currently hiding beneath the ground in Khan Yunis. Hezbollah. Big story. While I was there, they took out Salah al-Arori, the number 3 of Hamas, and they did so right in the heart of Dahia, in the stronghold of Hamas, of Hezbollah in Beirut. Of course, what followed several days later was a significant barrage coming out of Lebanon, and there have been some strategic targets that have been hit inside Israel. The general sense, though, is I think the Israelis seem happy with the targets that they're taking out. Rather than having an intense war with Hezbollah, they appear to be taking out a lot of the strategic targets, 1 or 2 a day, as opposed to the intense, kind of barrages that we see that typically kick off these wars. So that's the good news from their perspective. The bad news from their perspective is that, you have 120,000 some people that have been removed from the northern border. And those are the ones that the Israeli government have demanded. Then there are those that are saying, hey, we're not going to leave our families 300 yards further south of where the official border is. We're taking them out. So there's an unofficial number that has yet to be accounted for. I've not seen a good number there, but that is unacceptable in the long term for the Israelis. They believe that they have done the same to the southern communities of Lebanon, but that's really not their goal. they really are aiming for that re-upping of UN Security Council Resolution 1701. They want Hezbollah north of the Litani River. The notion that Israel will be able to somehow negotiate this through the UN and the French and the US seems very, very unlikely. I think there was a lot of pessimism there. And so it's for that reason that many Israelis believe that a clash with Hezbollah is ultimately likely. They're going to give diplomacy every chance they can, but especially as the real tough fighting begins to dwindle in Gaza, we could begin to see an uptick of Israeli strikes, where you don't just see sort of a one-for-one kind of an attack. The Hezbollah fires a rocket or a drone, and then Israel fires back with one or two responses. You may begin to see more of that. And no one said it to me directly, but I think everybody seemed to think that right now this is kind of a moment of truth with Hezbollah. And of course, none of this is going to help the Israelis in terms of the pressure they're feeling from the US. We're seeing that Blinken is trying to curb or contain a wider conflict. And of course, I think that is very much getting back to that the American political timeline. I don't think this administration wants to have a larger regional war on its hands heading into an election year. But the Israelis are saying to themselves, they're mobilized, and they're feeling like if they don't do this now, they don't know when they will do it. The only downside that I heard, and I had a lot of interesting conversations about the rationale for such a thing. I tend to think that it would be a mistake because Hezbollah is already mobilized. They do know that that the Israelis are openly thinking about this. So it's mobilized on both sides. The war would be really a fierce battle between what Israel would unleash on Hezbollah, and then Hezbollah, of course, is in possession of several hundred precision-guided munitions that could attack with lethal precision some Israeli strategic targets. So there's a lot of concern there. But yet they are thinking that this might be time to rip off the Band-Aid. And that debate is probably one of the most consequential ones I've heard in Israel in the many, many years that I've been going. The Houthis, there's a lot of concern just about the lack of international response. On the one hand, I think there is relief that Israel is not being directly pulled into this, that most of the rockets and things have been shot down. In fact, I think all of them have. But you are certainly seeing the expansion of the Iran-led proxy war in the region. And of course, Israel knows that all of the countries that are involved right now don't want to be dragged into a war in Yemen. Nobody wants to be dragged into a war in Yemen, so there is obviously concern there. The Shiite militias, similar concern. The lack of American response was palpable, hearing the concerns about that. As I understand it, there have been 126 attacks as of today. This is FDD research that we've been accumulating, and we'll put out a map on this soon, but 126 attacks with 8 responses. And so there's a fear among the Israelis that, Iran and its proxies are not contained, they're not deterred, and that they will continue to attack. And if that continues to happen, then we're going to see a more unstable Middle East. Speaking of unstable Middle East, the West Bank, we've seen 2,600 arrests and something like 300 different targeted kills of Hamas operatives since this war began. The West Bank has been quiet, but it's unclear how long that quiet can last for as long as this goes on. We do get a sense, or I got a sense, that security cooperation is actually still rather good between the PA and Israel, despite all of this. It's not being talked about, but I believe that, based reading between the lines, I believe that is what has kept things relatively calm. I think the West Bank leadership sees this as an opportunity to allow the Israelis to remove Hamas, of course, in light of the fact that Hamas and the PA have been in a state of civil war, essentially, since 2007. I am personally, one thing that I'm looking at that I would be concerned about, March 11th, is Ramadan. So when we think about what Ramadan has done in setting off the region over the last several years, setting off a war in 2021, and then another sort of mini war with Islamic Jihad in 2022, you do get a sense that Ramadan could play a role here, and it's obviously been used in the past as a kind of a motivator for violence by some of the armed groups. So that'll be something to watch. March 11th, I would say, is just a date to put in the back of everyone's minds. There is, of course, and I'll wrap up here in a minute, there is, I think, a broader concern about what to do about the Iran sort of ring of fire, the various Shiite militias that have been attacking both the United States and Israel. Iran has yet to pay a significant price for anything here. Obviously, the Israelis have targeted some Iranian officials, and we believe there's still cyber things that are happening inside inside Iran, probably carried out by the Israelis. But the idea of deterrence, the idea of kind of raising the stakes for Iran. I don't know if the Israelis have figured out exactly how to do that yet, but certainly one does get a sense that this war, even if Gaza begins to calm down, this is a war between Israel and Iran that was in the shadows for some time. They used to call it the campaign between wars. I'm not sure how in the shadows it is anymore. It seems like it's very much out in the open, and the Israelis, I think, have to do some serious thinking about how they want to end it on the right terms for them. And obviously, the Iranians are doing the same. The last thing I'll just say is, or maybe two more things, normalization. Apparently conversations are still happening all around the Gulf. The Israelis, are not public about it, but that there are ongoing contacts, and that has been, I think, a sign of optimism. I do know that the Israelis feel that the friction between the various aims of this war, on the one hand, they need to project strength, which is what really drew the Gulf Arab states to Israel in the first place. On the other hand, they need to make sure that civilians are safeguarded in Gaza. They need to make sure that people who are not combatants are not drawn into the fight. And that's something that the Arab states continue to convey to the Israelis. Obviously, the U.S. is conveying this too. But when the Israelis think about the day after, their day after, they are obviously concerned about maintaining those good ties. And so that's going to be, I think, an ongoing conversation. Last but not least, Israeli unity. I found that to be really one of the more heartening things of the trip, having been a couple times earlier this year where there were people out in the streets and vilifying one another. That seems to be gone. I mean, we are seeing the creeping back in of some politics, and right-wing politicians attacking Herzi Halevi, the chief of staff of the Israeli military. Those are the sorts of things that you don't want to see, if the idea is to sustain Israeli unity. But you did get a sense, or I got a sense throughout this trip, that they've put a lot of that anger and kind of the bitter debates behind them. One thing that I found fascinating is the deployment of Aharon Barak, the former Supreme Court justice, to go and defend the charges of genocide that were filed by South Africa. I'd say really a twisted interpretation of genocide, but nevertheless, the fact that he was deployed by this government that had so vilified him for the previous 10 months before this war began, and that he's now representing Israel at the behest of the government, does give you a sense of perhaps the way that the politics have turned a corner. Now, nothing's certain, and in Israel, things are always wacky, so we'll keep an eye on it. But I think that pretty much sums up the highlights of the trip and the key themes, and I'm very happy to take any questions you have.
Thanks, John, for that wide-ranging update. We'll now move into the Q&A portion of the call. We welcome and encourage your questions. A reminder that you can ask your question by either typing it into the chat or utilizing the raise hand feature. We have a question from Corinne Hajar from the Boston Globe, who asks, what will war with Hezbollah look like? Will strikes be confined to the south of Lebanon, stronghold in Beirut, or will this be a full-blown war that pulls in Lebanon's armed forces and other militias?
It's a good question, and I don't think anybody has any good answers for that. I will say that the first phase of this, if we're going to call it phases, has been southern Lebanon primarily. And from what I understand, the Israelis have actually hit a lot of what was there. The strikes have actually exposed a lot of the structures and the rocket launchers and things like that. So the southern Lebanon fighting is unlikely to widen significantly, although of course the ground forces is the major concern, the Radwan forces as they're known. If there was concern about, Gaza fighters, being able to cross over the border into Israel, the northern border is probably more susceptible. So I think we should probably expect there to be potential ground incursions, and that, of course, would set off the Israelis in ways that we haven't seen. I would expect Bekaa Valley, I would expect Dahia primarily, and southern Lebanon. But I think your question is a fair one as to whether the LAF gets involved. I don't know how much the LAF has in the tank for such a conflict. But Hezbollah, of course, has a massive rocket arsenal. And when we talk about what that war would look like, 200,000 rockets, 500 PGMs, ground forces that have trained alongside Russia, you get a sense that this is a different kind of battle that would take place. Nothing like what we saw in 2006, nothing like what we've seen in, 08, 12, 14, 21, and now 23 in Gaza. This could be a much wider conflict. And of course, the more Israel gets hit with strategic weapons, the more of a fierce response you'll see from the Israelis. So I shudder to think about this war. It's not one that I certainly would welcome. I tend to believe there would be a lot of destruction on both sides.
Thanks. Corinne has a second question. What should U.S. be doing better about Houthi strikes? Was sinking ship last week enough?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think apparently the strike that took place, I guess, last night or overnight, was said to be a Houthi response to that. And there were, I think, 21 different munitions that were fired at a single ship. They were apparently all shot down, which is great. But, it does look like the United States is playing defense more than anything else. A lot of talk has been about the designation of the Houthis. I think it's important symbolically. I don't know if it's going to make much of a difference militarily right now. But I do think that bringing in some of the other Arab states, we've seen really, I mean, it's been quiet from the Saudis, quiet from the UAE. And I understand they don't want to be drawn into a war, but I do believe that international pressure on Yemen, on the Houthis, could actually help here. We are, by the way, I've seen responses this morning from the Brits, the Italians, the Germans, the United States. There seems to be a coalition growing about the threat here. And so having a broader coalition that includes the Arab states, I think, would be important. But Hudaydah apparently, is going to be a key place here to try to, remove some of those rockets and missiles. It's going to be a challenge because I think bottom line is nobody wants to put a boot on the ground in Yemen. This is, a place where, victory is not easy to achieve. For years, people have said that there are 3 or 4 times as many heavy arms in Yemen as there are people. So 60 or 80,000 heavy weapons as opposed to the 25,000 people living there. Or 25 million people living there. So this is, nobody wants to put boots on the ground. So you may see airstrikes, which probably are overdue, but they need to be strategic, right? It needs to be getting at those rocket stores and missile stores and drone stores. Those are the things that I think need to be done here. And I can see why. Again, when you think about those timelines that I mentioned, this is not what the Biden administration wants to be doing heading into an election year, getting into a war in Yemen, whether it's, a full-fledged war or just, even just some tactical strikes. These are things that I think are not the headlines that the president was hoping for.
Okay, next question from David Brennan of Newsweek. He says, thanks for doing this briefing. What is the Israeli military intel analysis on Hezbollah's appetite or lack thereof for significant escalation? And what do they think are Nasrallah's primary goals vis-a-vis the current fighting?
Look, I mean, there are a couple things to point out. First of all, I'm not seeing that intel. I have no idea. But what I can say is that the Israelis seem again, somewhat pleased about the way that they were getting at a lot of these targets without having to wage a wider war, and that they believed that Hezbollah was aware of this dynamic, that they are losing almost all of the battles in these 1-for-1 or 2-for-1 attacks that are happening along along the south, that Israel is getting the best of Hezbollah. I did hear that there was some frustration that they believed that Hezbollah was experiencing because they've been constrained, whether by Iran, by themselves, by the United States, by the French, by the international community, by the Shiite community that doesn't want a war, or the broader community in Lebanon that doesn't want a war. They're constrained. And so you don't see them fighting the war that they're capable of. And for the fighters of such a force, right, deeply indoctrinated ideological people, that's a frustration. What that means, though, long term, I don't know. I mean, at the end of the day, I truly believe that, escalation, and we are watching escalation. It's not rapid escalation, but it's escalation. Those are the sorts of things that lead to mistakes, and mistakes ultimately lead to wars like what we saw in 2006. And so it's one to watch. I do think that the North is, I said it from the beginning of this war, as Beth knows, and others, I've been saying, watch the North, because what happens in the South may seem fierce and terrible, but it is really just a small taste of the kind of war that we could see in the North. And, Hezbollah started attacking Israel on October 8th, and they have attacked over and over again. I saw something in the Israeli press that it's been something like 600 attacks. I believe that it's been more like 1,000, maybe even 2,000 in terms of the total number of rockets, drones, infiltrations, and the like. There's a lot more, I think, that have not yet been disclosed. And, there's only so much of that the Israelis are going to put up with, especially with the northern communities vacated and with the economic losses. And you got to remember, every war has an economic cost. The Israelis are feeling that economic cost. The agricultural communities in the South and the North are paying a price. The businesses of the North and the South are paying a price. So the Israelis only have a certain amount of patience before they have to think about taking action. And again, as the pace in Gaza slows, that provides a possible opportunity for Israel to up the tempo in the North.
Okay, 2 questions from freelancer Verdiana Garu. First, even INSS expressed some concerns regarding Israeli cognitive war strategy, which might be too weak. We both know that casualties have been reduced to minimum and many Hamas operatives have been successfully killed, but media and public opinion didn't react accordingly. How can Israel reverse this trend?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely not my area of expertise. What I would say, though, is that the casualty numbers really do beg for deeper analysis. For the first, let's say, month of the war, the numbers were being put out by the Gaza Health Ministry, which was Hamas. Now, I don't even know who's putting out these numbers, right? Because Hamas has been removed from the vast majority of the hospitals in question. And so who's putting this stuff out? And are they do they have the expertise? Do they have the professional capabilities to track this in real time during a war? The number of Hamas fighters that I've seen, as far as numbers killed, is 8,000. The number of the total dead reported by the Gaza Health Ministry, or now ministries, is 22,000, and they're saying the vast majority of them are children, which would make no sense based on the images that we're seeing from the war. Based on the scenes, that are being captured on video by tanks and by ground units, we're seeing men primarily. But how they're getting to these numbers, how those numbers are getting out, I think part of it is just because there's no authority for this. People have been able to exaggerate, and they've been able to expand on numbers that I don't think we can trust just yet. I also think, by the way, we're going to see a lot of Hamas fighters found in tunnels that have been destroyed. And that will change the numbers. I don't know how much of it, the percentages will change, but this is a morbid stuff, and I generally try to stay away from it because I don't think there is a clear answer for any of it. I would only just say I don't know how to interpret the numbers that I see. They don't make sense to me yet. I'd like to be able to talk to folks on all sides. It's not right. It's not been possible just yet.
Okay, the second question from Verdiana regarding the Red Sea, since the lack of American response to Houthi attacks, in the future, could that potentially open an Arab-Israeli with the Saudi Arabia front and fighting, which is basically a trade war?
Look, I think so. I think, again, though, the Arab states have been remarkably quiet throughout all of this. Right? Like, the Saudis were just outraged about Houthi activity for years and furious that the United States hadn't designated. So now the US has actually attacked Houthi positions, and they've repelled Houthi attacks, and they've, intercepted Houthi missiles and drones. And there seems to be a lot of crickets coming out of the Gulf Arab states. You'd think that the Saudis and the Emiratis would say, way to go, guys, and let us know what else you need. Now, I have a strong sense that they're probably providing intelligence to the US and to others. But in terms of an open coalition, I don't see the Arab states going in this direction. I don't think they want to be lumped in with the Israelis right now, while the Israelis are dealing with Gaza. Now, that could change, by the way, if the war heads north to Hezbollah. I think there's far more open disdain among the Saudis and Emiratis and other Gulf states for Hezbollah. The Palestinian cause is a little bit different, and I think it's probably curbed their ability to speak their minds, even if they hold somewhat similar disdain privately for Hamas.
Next question from Lena Argeri, Greek Public Broadcasting. How effective is the U.S. pressure, and what is the state of U.S.-Israel relations right now?
So it's interesting, on the one hand, the relationship has probably never been better. Again, I heard nothing but thank yous from the Israelis that I spoke to, just talking about how the administration had been terrific and that they were closely coordinating, and lots of phone calls and lots of conversations. The pressure, I think, really right now stems from the civilian casualties, which of course is odd because we heard Secretary of State Blinken talk about Hamas human shields and how they were using the population as a means to deter Israeli strikes, and then when the death toll rises as a result of human shield usage, Hamas turns around and blames the Israelis. It's a bit weird to blame the Israelis when you can recognize that that's going on. But yet this is where we are. And again, I do think it's these political timelines that I think really are driving a lot of this conversation. I believe that this administration would like the Gaza war to be no longer a major headline in the United States. And that really does feel like where the tension is. My general sense is that if you don't hold the Israelis back and you give them the time and space that they need right now to finish the job, I think the war will end far more sooner, and it'll be out of the headlines far more quickly than asking them to slow down, asking them to change tactics. Because then what happens is there'll be peaks and valleys of different battles that are fierce, and then things will go calm, and then they'll be fierce again. I think that it's probably in the American interest to let the Israelis finish the job as they need to, and then try to curb that regional war, which is really what the U.S. doesn't want heading into 2024. But overall, I think the relationship is good. Even as the Israelis are maybe a little confounded by the lack of response to the Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria, and they're not quite sure what the U.S. policy is vis-a-vis the Houthis, they certainly feel like they're not alone in all of this right now. That, by the way, may be of no comfort to the U.S. But there is a sense here that they've not been left out to dry, not at the UN and not on the battlefield, not yet. But they are feeling the pressure for things to wind down. They are feeling the pressure for a day after scenario. This is the stuff that they like. We know the US wants from them. It's like, okay, you've done what you need to do. Now finish. And the Israelis are saying, not yet, but we're getting there, right? If you ask me, Khan Yunis takes another 2 weeks, let's say. And then after that, there's a big question, which I didn't get to here, but this also came up, the Rafah crossing, the town that abuts Egypt. That is probably the place where the vast majority of operative tunnels still exist. And those tunnels are the tunnels that are going to allow for weapons to come in and for fighters and even Hamas leaders to leave. And so there is going to have to be a serious conversation that takes place between the Netanyahu government and the Sisi regime. That's a big one. That's a big, big thing that's looming.
Okay, 2 questions from Jeff Selden of VOA. First, what do Israeli counterterrorism officials make of the global protests in support of Gaza and sometimes even blatantly Hamas? Is there any thought that Hamas or Iran are looking to use or are using them to expand their networks into the West?
Oh, I think there's no doubt in anyone's mind that these are that these protests are being wielded by what we would broadly call a Muslim Brotherhood network to put pressure on Western governments and to incite hatred, if not violence, against Israel or pro-Israel people in the West. And so there's a lot of interest in what's going on here, London, Paris, etc. I didn't have any distinct answers coming out of them, though, in terms of how to interpret this information, but they do believe that that this is sort of a broader Muslim Brotherhood network. And of course, Hamas is a splinter group of the Muslim Brotherhood from when it was formed in late 87, early 88. It was a decision to break off from the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood. So they still have a fairly significant amount of support coming from these networks. And you've got to remember, the Muslim Brotherhood is the first or second largest grassroots Islamist organization in the world, depending on who's counting, right? But 1 or 2 is pretty big. We're talking about hundreds of millions of people.
Okay, the second question from Jeff Selden. How concerned is Israel about what seems to be the strengthening of Iran's proxies and proxy network? This weekend, for example, one Iranian-backed militia claimed it fired a cruise missile at Haifa.
Yeah. Look, there's a lot of concern. I think there's a question of how long this can go for before the Israelis need to have Iran pay a price. This has been, I think, the big picture issue is, look, the Israelis have done, I think, from the way they look at it, they've done a good job of taking out one tentacle, if you will, from the octopus. This is the term that everybody uses all the time. I'm not sure I love it, but I'm just telling you what I heard. So Hamas is one, and then they may need to go north to Hezbollah. Then there are the questions of the Shiite militias in Syria and Iraq. Then there's the Houthis, right? There are a lot of tentacles here, and the head of the octopus, as they say, is stayed safe and secure within its borders. And so the question for the Israelis is, how do you get Iran to pay a price for any of this? I don't seem to see any answers here. There are still, by the way, getting back to the question of U.S. relations, there is this sort of question about, if the U.S. tries to still go back into a nuclear deal with Iran, that's going to help support these proxy groups, right, financially. And so there is a lot of concern there. But right now we're not on the precipice of such a deal. I just think it's something that's looming out there in the back of their minds.
Another question from Newsweek's David Brennan. You mentioned that the IDF is seeking to rebuild its brand after October 7. Is there concern among Israeli civilian or military decision makers that the foreign perception of this new brand is being colored by the devastation and casualties we're seeing in Gaza?
No, actually, it's really interesting. I mean, what the way that the IDF and the way that the Israeli public is looking at this is just they've been talking about how look at how well the special forces have been operating, the integration of the Navy and the ground forces and the Air Force. Look at the way the reservists are, are operating. Low casualties on the U.S. side, on the Israeli side, no request for U.S. troops. Right? I mean, they're doing this on their own. They don't want any foreign boots on the ground. They're doing it all on their own. They're proud of the performance up until now. They're aware of the criticism about casualty counts and the like. But I think this is actually maybe one of the more important points to convey. That shame that I talked about, right? That shame came from the abrogation of the contract that exists between every population and every government, right? The population relies on the government to protect the people. In Israel, that contract is sacred, even probably beyond what we see from other militaries and other governments, given the history of the Jewish people. There is this sense that the government and the military of Israel have almost like a holy mission, if you will. And so as they see the military fighting and keeping the ratio down very low in terms of Israeli KIAs, there has been a fierce sense of pride, and they believe that they have kind of turned a corner because they really did not believe that the people were behind the military in the beginning. They were very concerned about the lack of performance on October 7th. So now we're seeing something that looks very different right now, a turning of the corner. But that media narrative, it's funny, I watch 3 or 4 hours of Israeli television a day. I switch between the right wing and the left wing and the center channels and things like that. And I just don't think that the Israeli public and the Israeli media, they just know they have to win the war. That's their mentality. They are not thinking about the public relations battle as a top priority. Maybe it's a second or third, but their whole thing is, okay, got to defeat Hamas and let the people of the southern communities return to their homes. Got to defeat Hezbollah, let the people of the northern communities return to their homes, right? This is about restoring the contract with the people. That is their top priority. The other stuff, secondary, tertiary, which, by the way, may be part of their problem.
Well, participants think of any other questions. I'll ask a few. I'm curious, John, about what you heard about the expansion of the Abraham Accords. On January 8th, Secretary Blinken was in Israel, and he tied Saudi-Israel normalization to Palestinian statehood. And how is that being received in Jerusalem?
Look, they would love to see the Saudis and the Emiratis take a role in the future of Gaza. And some of the day after scenarios that I heard from different officials, explicitly noted that they want to invite the Saudis and the Emiratis in to have them take part, maybe even give them sections of Gaza that they could develop almost in competition with each other, if you will, not in any kind of derogatory way, but the idea that there'd be a Saudi section of Gaza, there'd be an Emirati section of Gaza, there'd be a European section of Gaza, an American section of Gaza. Whether that ultimately plays out, I don't know. But I think the Israelis are still very much thinking about the role of regional integration as it relates to all of this. They are, I will say though, they're deeply concerned about the viability of the Palestinian Authority, especially under Mahmoud Abbas. And I think what they're hearing from the Gulf states is we agree. They're also concerned. So it doesn't look like they're in fierce disagreement on much. It's just really the optics of the war that, again, the Gulf Arab states, they get a little nervous about a lot of these things. They just don't want their people getting angry with them about what's going on. So they're keeping all of this at arm's length for now. When the war hopefully ends soon, I think we're very likely to see a return of the rapprochement. I will say just one last thing. People don't seem to get this often when we talk about normalization, but I always say normalization is a process, not an event. So we like the idea of a handshake on the White House lawn and a big, celebration. Normalization's already happening with all of these countries, including probably Saudi Arabia to some extent or another. We know that there are contacts that have already been made. Those contacts are probably ongoing. It's just really a question of how much anybody wants to stick their neck out right now while the Israelis are in the midst of a tough battle in Gaza.
Okay, final question from me before I think we'll be wrapping it up. What should be the role of the UN regarding the pending, as you noted, Israel-Hezbollah war? Can you walk us through UN Resolution 1701 and how the UN and the US and Israel are thinking about that today?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's two components. One is that there should be no non-state actor serving as a military power, and the idea of Hezbollah holding up shop is nil. The idea of forcing Hezbollah north of the Litani River, several kilometers north of the border, that's more feasible. And I think that's where we see guys like Amos Hochstein trying to focus. And, you got French diplomats and American diplomats. I see, by the way, UNIFIL doing virtually nothing. And really, I mean, I'm shocked at how little attention there has been placed on the failure of the United Nations across the board, whether it's UN Women looking at sex crimes that took place on October 7th and may still be happening subsequently. UNRWA, there have been multiple reports now of UNRWA officials in Gaza with deep ties to Hamas and cheering on the attacks. And I mean, there was actually a raid in the West Bank showing that a kindergarten run by UNRWA was a place where weapons were being stored. I mean, it's just one horrific failure after another. I think this war has brought into focus to me how broken the international system is. Certainly in the Middle East, but I don't think it's limited to the Middle East. And I think that there's a lot of work to be done after this. I don't, by the way, think that the UN will reform itself. I don't expect there to be some kind of a commission along the lines of what I think will soon come in Israel, where, they're all going to take a look at who failed and how. That's not the nature of the UN. So the question is, in my mind, does the US, as the contributor of 20% or so of the budget, do we have the leverage here, perhaps working with other countries to begin to enact some of this reform? But it's a tough time to enact reform when you've got the Chinese manipulating this system and the Russians manipulating this system and the Iranians. This is tough stuff here, but you can see at the micro level, UNRWA, UNIFIL, UN Women, it's been a disaster one after another.
All right, we just got a question in from Bridiana. You said you have been watching TV, right, left media, etc. What's the general mood regarding a possible two-state solution, which is actually what Gulf requires to follow the path?
What the Gulfies want. Yeah. It does not seem likely right now. Certainly Channel 14, sort of BB's, Fox TV, if you will. You're not seeing a whole lot there. Channel 13, which is the centrist, they're not talking about two-state solution in any significant way. I think and even on Channel 11, the public broadcaster, Channel 12, which is more left-wing news, you're not seeing a whole lot of, gosh, we have to get back to Oslo. What I have heard, and I heard on the ground there as well, is we need something other than Oslo. If you tell the Israelis that they have to go back to doing what they did that failed and that led to the second intifada from 2000 to 2005, and that in many ways actually set the stage for where we are right now, right? Because it was two-state solution that kind of ultimately prompted Bush to push Ariel Sharon to withdraw from Gaza, and that left it susceptible to Hamas rule. You could see one thing led to another and led to another that led Israel to this place. And they're saying this is not how it needs to get done. Their two-state solution that I've heard of, again, this gets back to the Gulf stuff, and it's about rebuilding Gaza. The thinking that I heard, and again, I don't want to say that this is the official thinking. This is a stream or a strain that I heard throughout the conversations, that Gaza needs to be fixed, and that there needs to be the rebuilding of a government, a self-governing entity, because the Israelis don't want to be there to govern long term. And they want to make sure that it's success, so they want to have good partners to do this. If there is change that happens on the West Bank side of things, i.e., the removal or the departure of Mahmoud Abbas, who is, of course, in his 80s and is deeply corrupt and not really able to govern, if he leaves while this other process is taking place, there may be a moment where things can merge and you can create a joint government. But it has to be under very different circumstances than what was done before. One thing that I heard that I thought was interesting is, the PA as an equal partner in these negotiations is going to be difficult right now, given the failures of governance in the West Bank and the collapse of Gaza after Hamas. There needs to be something else, and this next something else is more vulnerable. It is not it's not in a position right now to be making demands. It really needs to be directed by an international community that is really looking to rebuild everything from the ground up.
All right, I think it's time to wrap it up. You spoke about UNIFIL and its failures to keep out Hezbollah at the Lebanon-Israel border. In your final comments, I would love you to touch on the future of UNRWA.
Yeah, I mean, UNRWA doesn't need to exist. It exists as a dedicated agency for the Palestinian refugee problem. Of course, before this war, there really wasn't a refugee problem. Now there is one. But I don't believe that UNRWA is the agency that should be handling this. I would like to see the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, which handles every other refugee problem in the world. That would seem like a very, logical approach to this problem. Maybe UN peacekeeper forces in Sinai, but the idea of UNRWA, which has multiple Hamas figures on its payroll, and that it's been implicated time and again in attacks that have taken place against Israel, tunnels that exist beneath their facilities. This is just not a viable agency anymore. It needs to be folded up. It was, it's been around since the 1950s. It's gotten steadily worse. It was amazing. I mean, it went from 600 or 800,000 Palestinian refugees after 1948 because they recognized the descendants of refugees. They now say that they have 5.6 million. And mathematically, that's impossible of the original refugees, but they've minted in generations of refugees. They've failed to fix the problem, unless, of course, fixing the problem in their mind means creating more and more crisis between the Palestinians and Israelis. So I think they've lost legitimacy. We need to have another conversation about what happens next. I'm not sure this is exactly the right time, but I think after Gaza completely is devoid of Hamas rule, that may be the time to have this discussion. That could be a few weeks away.
Okay, we'll end it there. Thanks again to you, Jonathan, and to all of you for joining today. In closing, a reminder that FDD is a nonpartisan research institute focusing on national security and foreign policy. We closely monitor press at fdd.org. Please send us an email anytime if we can be helpful, and we'd be glad to connect you with Dr. Schanzer or our other experts. Thank you again for your time. This concludes our call.